Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New York Bee Wellness webinar. My name is Pat Bono, President and founder of New York Bee Wellness. And New York Bee Wellness is an educational, grassroots, not-for-profit 501c3, and it is volunteer run. It has a dedicated website, a YouTube channel. It does 2 surveys a year for smaller scale non-migratory beekeepers and conducts workshops. This year, the New York Bee Wellness Workshop was to be held in Rochester, New York area, and our main instructor or speaker was to be Jerry Hayes. Unfortunately, the workshop was canceled due to COVID, but Jerry Hayes has agreed to do this webinar, and so I present to you Jerry Hayes. And Jerry, are you ready?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Pat, and thanks for everybody who is out there. I don't know how many are there, but at least if we have one, that will be terrific. Sorry I can't be face-to-face in these crazy times, but I suppose that this is probably the best second option. And so I'm proud and honored to be able to share a little bit of time with all of you beekeepers. I'm going to spend some time with you tonight talking about Varroa mites. And not that you haven't heard about Varroa mites 500 times, but hopefully this will be a little bit different perhaps, and remind us all of things that bees do and why they're important, and why we should be good beekeeper managers in 2020. So, Varroa mites, what we think we know so far, because like everything else in the world, science progresses at a certain rate, and we learn, and we've learned a ton about Varroa mites, especially over the last couple years, actually. But I want to kind of back up a little bit and kind of focus on why we are beekeepers, perhaps, why honeybees are important. And honeybees are important for us many times because of honey, that relationship that honeybees have with flowers that produce nectar that lure honeybees in, so that flower, that plant, can use the honeybee to carry pollen to another flower and reproduce. Honey is a wonderful product. It's the taste of summer, different colors, different textures, different flavors and tastes, and they can be from your beehive every year and be just a little bit different. Wonderful, wonderful product. But that's not why really honeybees are important to us humans and livestock and many other things. This is, I had Pat send me a picture of her breakfast this morning. This is a picture of Pat's breakfast. And Pat actually eats pretty well here. You can see she has toast and jam and eggs and, you know, juice and coffee with cream, and then she's got some, you know, that dried nuts and fruit and just a wonderful, wonderful breakfast, and the melons and the strawberries and what have you. And I wanted to see what Pat's breakfast would look like if we didn't have honeybees, if we didn't have honeybees in production agriculture. That's Pat's breakfast without honeybees. The juice is gone because honeybees didn't pollinate that flower on that cherry tree or apple tree to allow a seed to be formed. Because if a seed is formed, the plant will build a fruit around it. If a seed isn't pollinated, that embryo doesn't turn into a seed, that plant isn't going to waste the time and the energy mostly to build a fruit around there. So her juice is gone. All that nutrition is gone. Coffee's still there. Bees pollinate coffee a little bit, but the cream is gone. And you say, well, you know, honeybees don't have anything to do with cows. Well, you know, they do, because honeybees pollinate alfalfa, which feeds a cow, which makes the milk, which makes the cream. So that connection is broken. The jam on her toast is gone because of that same reason. That relationship between the honeybee and that fruit producing plant has been disruptive, and you don't have that fruit anymore. Eggs are still there, but those wonderful melons and berries are gone for the same reason that the bees weren't able to pollinate those to produce a seed to help the plant build a fruit around that section. And in the granola stuff is still there, but you know, the almonds are gone, the dried fruit are gone. So this is why honeybees are important, and this is why you are important. Your bees you may not have 5,000 colonies of bees, but your bees still forage efficiently in about a 2.5 mile radius of their colony. And as they do, they might visit an apple orchard or somebody's apple tree in their backyard, or your apple tree, or those squash, or the cantaloupe, or whatever out there, as they interact with the environment to produce those fruits, nuts, and berries that we all find nutrition in and love to eat. And then we never talk about this, but how about that environmental benefit? How about that pollination of those plants that produce a seed, nut, or berry that feed birds or deer or squirrels, or just reproduce so that they can produce food for other animals? So honeybees, whether you have one colony or 5,000, are incredibly important, not only for food production for ourselves, but for the environment. And then this is just reinforcement of what we just said about how important honeybees are to our food supply. This is Whole Foods Market. They had a advertising campaign a couple of years ago showing their produce section and what it would look like if those fruits, nuts, and berries and vegetables that are there because of honeybee activities and beekeepers' management of those bees wasn't available. And if you think about it, when you go grocery shopping, when you go in that big box store or Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or what have you, you ever notice you don't walk into the aisle with the toilet paper or the cleaners or the mops? You walk into the produce section because that's where colors and smells and that connection to that wholesome food is, because of honeybees. That's why honeybees are important. But as you all know, or probably most of you know, some of you may not know, I have been in the beekeeping industry before Varroa and now, and we used to have 5 million colonies just a few decades ago. Now we're down to about 2.45 million colonies in the United States that are responsible in many cases for producing those fruits, nuts, and berries that feed us and help feed our livestock. Commercial beekeepers, migratory beekeepers who can load 500-600 colonies on a semi and drive it around the United States to different pollination events are the gypsies that keep us fed. Because we have 330 million people in the US currently. And so those folks like fruits, nuts, and berries. And so there's more agricultural acres planted with pollinator dependent crops than most states can provide with the bees in those states. And that's why we have migratory commercial beekeepers who travel all over the United States to fill that gap so that growers can actually produce a crop. And to produce a crop, to travel on a semi, to be unloaded in New York in an apple orchard, and then fly and pollinate requires healthy honeybees, not sick honeybees, not even a little bit sick, but healthy honeybees that the queen is laying, she's producing brood, and the foragers have to go out and collect resources to feed their developing baby sisters. And the Varroa mite has negatively impacted colony health for quite a while now, since the late 80s, as most of you know. And most of you have experienced when you sample and treat, and maybe you've lost colonies over the winter or what have you. Most of the time, you can chalk that up to Varroa mites and our incomplete or poor job at controlling them. Varroa mite's a huge, huge parasite. If you were a honeybee and had a Varroa on your back, it would be about the size of a big soccer ball or maybe even a basketball feeding on you. So it's a huge, huge parasite. It's a little bug, if you will, on a bigger bug. But that little bug does tremendous damage while it's trying to live, while it's trying to reproduce and using our honeybees to do it. Think of Varroa as a dirty needle. Every time it pierces the honeybee's cuticle, well, it's kind of like mosquitoes. When a mosquito bites you, the mosquito, first thing the mosquito does is basically spit into you, and it spits in enzymes and chemicals that discourage your immune system from closing off that feeding site, because that mosquito wants to feed on you, on your blood, so it can reproduce and feed its babies. Well, think of a Varroa mite, that big basketball parasite that is feeding on a honeybee. It does the same thing. And so if the Varroa mite has viruses in it, it's going to vector or transfer those viruses, of course. And then because it has those same similar chemicals in it that discourage the bee's shallow immune system from sealing off that feeding site, those viruses that are in honeybees normally and naturally, just like we have viruses in us, because the immune system is suppressed, they can start growing and reproducing because there's nothing to hold them in check. So this is how Varroa mites continually cause honeybee health issues, is because of this continuous negative stress on individual honeybees, which then is translated into most of the members of a colony. The original host of Varroa is a honeybee, Apis cerana. Ours are Apis mellifera. Apis cerana is a tropical, subtropical species of honeybees that worked out, if you will, a relationship with Varroa mites over the millennia. They agreed, I won't kill you off if you don't kill me off. And Ceranae is highly, highly hygienic. They groom tremendously to remove tropholaylips. They maintain very small colonies, tremendously small. In a good season, a colony of Apis cerana will produce maybe a liter of honey. That's all. And then tropholaylips decided, well, I'll only reproduce on your drone brood, your males, and I won't bother your worker brood. So that was kind of the agreement that they made. And so how the heck did we get Varroa on Apis mellifera? Well, towards the beginning of the last century, 1900s, when there was lots of trade going on with Europe and America and what have you, a lot of those traders, those sailors, somehow shared stories of honeybees in America or Europe with those in Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and what have you. Those folks were impressed with those stories that those sailors told of having these huge, huge colonies that would produce, 50 kilos or 100 pounds of honey. And they were huge because the sailors were looking at these beekeepers, honeybee colonies that were very, very small and, kind of making fun of them. And so those people in Asia decided that they wanted some of those European honeybees, and they were brought over to them. And like everything else in nature, these colonies were put next to the Apis cerana colonies, and everybody kind of coexisted for a while until, life finds a way. Tracheal mite female figured out how to reproduce on Apis mellifera, a European honeybee that had a little bit different development time. But instead of just reproducing on drone brood, they figured out how to reproduce on worker brood as well. And so that caused tremendous more stress and management issues for beekeepers trying to keep this pest from killing and destroying whole colonies of European bees that they didn't do on Apis cerana. And then with global trade and bees traveling around and queens in cages, tracheal mites have made it most around Asia for sure. And, I'm kind of surprised that they haven't made it to Europe, but they're headed towards the Middle East, and sooner or later, we will have tropholaylaps not only in Europe, but in the United States and Canada as well, just because of global trade. This is a female Varroa mite. She's the one that starts the reproductive stage and causes our problems that we are experiencing now in honeybee health issues. That's a male Varroa mite. Male Varroa mites are kind of like male drone honeybees. They're basically walking gametes, they're sperm storage sacs, really. And they're smaller, they're more delicate. You can see that male doesn't have a hard cuticle because that male never leaves the cell that he is in until he has mated in there. This is a Varroa family right here. There's males, there's growing females in that cell as they mature so that they can leave and do what life does. Life tries to reproduce, and a honeybee colony is a great place to do it. The female Varroa mite, when she's mated, leaving that cell, will go find another cell that's opened, not capped, that has a very young larva in it that's floating in, that larval food that we see, that very white, milky material at the bottom of the cell that is the larva's food. She will enter that cell and submerge herself in that larval food. She doesn't want to be seen. She doesn't want to be recognized and then hurt or stopped from reproducing. So she submerges, goes under that liquid food and sends up an organ in her body. It's kind of like a snorkel so that she can breathe and yet still be unrecognizable as she hides in that liquid food. When that cell is capped, she will emerge, lay a male egg, and then lay a couple female eggs. And when those eggs hatch, the male will mate with those females. He'll mate with his sisters. And that's actually a other no genetic PowerPoint of how that happens, and you don't get inbreeding problems. But they do that. They feed on that developing larva pupa, and then they, if that bee is still alive and can uncap itself, they'll emerge, and the whole process starts all over again. And when you have a queen laying, say, 2,000 eggs a day, she might be doing now, that's a lot of opportunity for Varroa mites to reproduce as well. And Varroa, of course, can kill in several ways. We've talked about viruses, of course, but I want to mention some things that you probably have heard about, but we want, and I can't make this work here, but this is just a Varroa, showing a Varroa, and if you can see back here is their digestive system, kind of white, and you can see it moving as the head is down here, and that Varroa mite is feeding on fat bodies in that bee. And golly, a long time ago, Dr. Alan Cohen, who wasn't necessarily a bee person, but he was a mite person, looked in cells and saw this white stuff here, which is Varroa poop. And the story had always been that Varroa, when they bite, make a feeding entry wound, feed on the bee's hemolymph, feed on the bee's liquid blood. And Dr. Cohen said, well, that can't be, because if you feed on blood, your poop isn't going to look like that. Your poop is going to be liquid too, because there's so much moisture in it, but this is semi-solid. And nobody really paid attention to him until a couple years ago when Dr. Sammy Ramsey decided to explore this feature and came up with some definitive data showing that Varroa mites feed on not hemolymph primarily, but the fat bodies, the vitellogenin in a honeybee. We used to think that Varroa were baby vampires feeding on the blood, but not anymore. We know now that those Varroa mites are feeding on the fat bodies. And this is really kind of key right here, because of everything those fat bodies do and present to the honeybee. So the fat bodies can also regulate growth and development because of the hormones they produce. They're also obviously a place for nutrient storage. That's where they store food. You know, our bees, depending on where you are going to start producing winter bees, those long-lived winter bees that have more and bigger fat bodies. And so if that fat body is damaged and they can't store that energy, that can't store the protein, those amino acids, then you have a real issue with honeybees being able to survive a long cold winter when they may not be able to freely get around the hive and access honey and bee bread. The fat bodies also help with metamorphosis, those changes from one stage to another of larval and pupa development. They also regulate water in a honeybee. They are part of the immune system, and any decrease in fat bodies means that you have less of immune system when a honeybee has a very shallow immune system anyway as an individual. Thermal regulation, they help the bees stay warm because of the energy that they supply when winter comes, when the temperature gets below 57 degrees Fahrenheit. They regulate metabolic activity in the bee because they're, again, of the hormones they produce and the energy that is stored in those fat bodies. They can also synthesize or change protein, break down into amino acids, reconfigure that, lipids, the fat, how they can synthesize that, and also this vitellogenin, the vitellogenesis, reduction in vitellogenin decreases a honeybee's lifespan and increased overwinter mortality. So Varroa mites not only are impacting with perhaps viruses that they're vecting or immunosuppression, but because of their feeding on the fat bodies of honeybees, they're impacting that honeybee's metabolic regulation on so many different levels that no wonder it makes it hard for honeybees to live through the winter and or shortens their lifespan in the summertime so that they don't live as long and their sisters have to take their place, and sometimes you have a real replacement issue there. So we used to think honeybees were like baby vampires, but now we know they're like baby werewolves, eating, feeding on honeybee fat bodies. And then we have, of course, the honeybee viruses that we've talked about. These viruses that are using honeybee cells to reproduce. Not all viruses are bad. Many of the viruses are kept in check if the honeybee is healthy, if it has complete fat bodies and has good nutrition. But if it doesn't, then that virus can start reproducing. And that's why we have acute bee paralysis virus and deformed wing virus and these 30 other viruses that impact honeybee health. So keeping Varroa under control is key in this way as well. Because you can have healthy honeybees, but if their immune system is compromised, if the virus loads in the cell are being horizontally transferred, you can see that bee on the right has been impacted by deformed wing virus. That virus that has reproduced in that honeybee because she could not control the virus. Her immune system, her nutrient levels couldn't control the virus. That honeybee is not a honeybee. She can't fly. She can't leave the colony and go visit a flower and pollinate it and fly to the next. She is lost. And she is a reservoir for the foreign wing virus and probably other viruses that her body can't control and contain. And many times her sisters will recognize that and drag her out of the colony and block her entrance back in. And then you have, of course, acute death. The bees died quickly, completely, because of this nutrition virus connection, or chronically. You see that bee, you know, it's kind of like you or I. We can get a cold or a flu or something, and you know, we're not dead. but you just don't feel good. You don't want to go to work. You don't want to do anything. You want to lay in bed till you feel better. Well, it's the same thing with the honeybees. Sometimes they just don't feel good and they don't want to go out. They can't go out and do what honeybees are supposed to do. And oh my gosh, do we have a plethora of control options, none of which are the silver bullet, none of which are complete, none of which don't have some collateral damage to them. But we have to have them, we have to use them, because we don't have any other options, unless, of course, like so many beekeepers out there, especially new beekeepers, and most of you probably aren't new beekeepers, you probably know this, that so many beekeepers have decided to not treat their bees for Varroa and let them die every year, blame somebody or something else, and then buy new packages from somebody that, of course, have Varroa and pesticide issues with them and everything else. And so are these great things to use? We don't have a choice if you want to keep your honeybees alive. And talking about keeping honeybees alive, before this whole COVID thing, I traveled quite a bit. And I was in an airport someplace, I think it was Houston, and the flight was delayed. So we were all standing around just, waiting for time. And this lady next to me started chatting and what have you. And she said, I said, oh, where are you going? And she said, I'm going to a conference for PETA, P-E-T-A, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. These are the people that want us to treat our dogs and our cats and our chickens and our pigs and everything in perfect ways. And she said she was going there, and what did I do for a living? And at the time, I was working on a product called RNAi for Monsanto. And I wasn't going to tell her I worked for Monsanto. Oh my gosh, no. So I just said I was a beekeeper. And she said, oh, a beekeeper. And yeah, everybody knows about honeybees. And so I told her about how big a Varroa mite was and if it was on her and what would happen and what Varroa feed on and virus transmission and all this other kind of stuff. And I then offered, I said, some beekeepers refuse to treat their colonies for Varroa and prefer to let them die and, of course, infect every other colony within a mile. And this lady from PETA, which I'll never forget in my whole life, said, there are control products, there are control options available, and people refuse to use them? That is horrific. And she was absolutely right. Why would you allow an animal to die if there are control options? Why would you be so lazy that you didn't want to sample your colonies to find out what control products you wanted to use to keep them alive and healthy? So I'll never forget that as long as I live. Of course, we have screen bottom boards that, Varroa mites, when they're in the colony, sometimes are kind of spastic and kind of lose their grip or fall off a bee. And if they fall to the bottom of a colony that has a solid bottom board, they can kind of pick themselves up and dust themselves off and climb back in the colony. If it's in a screen bottom board that's above the ground a little bit, the Varroa mite probably will fall through that screen onto the ground. And because of the distance and predators, ants and things and stuff under the colony, it can't get back in the colony. So that's an IPM technique. And just to give you an idea about how mobile, agile, and hostile varroa mites are, a few years ago, I was working on a research project as the chief of the apiary section for the Florida Department of Agriculture. And I had one of my inspectors go out and collect varroa mites using powdered sugar method. And he brought me back a small Rubbermaid tub with probably 1,000 varroa mites in it that we were going to use for some research project in our lab. I was busy with administrative stuff, so I said thank you and put that small Rubbermaid tub behind my desk and went on about my business for about, probably about 90 minutes, I guess. And then I felt kind of something like, like something's climbing up my ankle. And what had happened was those varroa mites, and I measured this, had climbed up the 7-inch side of the Rubbermaid tub, down the 7-inch side, across about 2 feet of my carpeted floor in my office, and were climbing up my pants leg. And I was truly impressed because many PhDs at the time out there said, varroa mites are like all the other mites, all these plant mites. When they don't have their host, they stop and put out their legs into a stance, waiting for the next bee, in this case, to go by so that they can grab a hold of the bee and go in there. That was a big lie. These guys climbed up 7 inches, down 7 inches, across my floor, and were going up my pants leg. So getting them out of a colony, one of the ways to get them out of a colony, of course, is with a screen bottom board. And then we have, Thymol and menthol essential oil products, Apistan, which is fluvalinate. We have formic acid. We have all these crazy things with the oxalic acid and lots of options out there for you. There are perhaps too many options, but whatever option you select, you need to read the instructions and follow the label directions, because that is what the manufacturer and EPA or FDA has agreed is the best way for that product to be used to control varroa mites and not negatively impact honeybees or the colony or honey production or what have you. So always follow label instructions. And what would a PowerPoint be if you didn't have a couple of graphs that nobody can see? These are a couple graphs from a paper by Anderson and Truman, and it's the toxicity of selected acaricides to honeybees. When we talk about acaricides, those are basically pesticides. We're trying to kill, hurt, or damage a bug on a bug, which is super, super hard. You can certainly dose things down, but if you're not careful and following label instructions, you're going to hurt the big bug. And so if you want to look, a little bit, especially to that graph to the left, Checkmite is an organophosphate. I have no earthly idea how an organophosphate, which is super, super toxic, ever got approved in the Clinton administration, but it did. So you can see that have two colors here, kind of an orange and kind of a gold or a yellow. The orange is Varroa toxicity and the orange is bee toxicity. Look at that to the left there, the mortality percent. Check mite in a full dose kills the heck out of varroa mites. But look at what it does to honeybees. Highly toxic, I would say, to honeybees. Check mite in half a dose controls varroa mites fairly well, and it really lowers the mortality on honeybees. Apistan, which is fluvalinate, which varroa mites have developed some level of resistance to, kills varroa mites well, has relatively low bee mortality. Apivar is amitraz, also kills varroa well, low bee mortality. Apigard, which is a thymol gel, does well on varroa, low bee mortality. Hopguard, boy, according to this graph, it kills almost as many bees as it does varroa. So yeah, think about that one. And then half a dose of Hopguard and varroa control and honeybee deaths as well. And then of course the control below, which, you know, not very many varroa controlled and you know, virtually no bees either. So the whole point of this is that you need to be highly selective in varroa control products that you use, because there will be collateral damage because of them. If you don't use those products, the damage will be that you will have killed all your honeybee colonies because you didn't control varroa. Just remember that when you put something in a beehive to kill varroa mites, that first you have to remember that not all the varroa mites are in that phoretic or dispersal stage. They're not all out in the open. 2/3 of your varroa mites are going to be behind capped cells all the time. That's why in the sampling procedure, they have come up with these counts that give you an idea of varroa numbers in your colony based on your sample size. But when we put chemicals in a beehive and we want it to get on a honeybee so that those phoretic, those dispersal exposed varroa mites are exposed, honeybees groom themselves all the time to clean themselves up, to clean their hairs off and get ready. And so they ingest this stuff as well. And so that becomes systemic in them. And that's one of the reasons we don't have too many reports anymore of tracheal mites. Some of you may have heard of tracheal mites, but they were the first mite before varroa that live in the bee's breathing tubes and feed on hemolymph in the breathing tubes. But if varroa size becomes systemic in the bee and these tracheal mites are feeding on the bee, they're killed and impacted by those varroa sides. So raise your right hand and say, I will always follow label directions. Because we have another issue, chemical residues in wax. This is another graph that shows that beeswax, which is a fatty acid, is a chemical sponge. It will grab onto and hold on to all sorts of chemicals, what we put in a hive and what bees bring back from the environment. Another story from an old beekeeper, which would be me, is we were doing some field research in Florida. And this was just at the beginning of colony collapse disorder. And we were trying to find out about toxic residues in beehives. So myself and many, many other beekeepers, but myself and my lab were asked to submit samples of bees and wax and brood and what have you to USDA to be analyzed. Well, I was thinking we're in pretty good shape because our field trials, I had purchased all new equipment, all new wax. The bees were new, and we were treating for Varroa using powdered sugar once a week to knock down those phoretic mites and keep them from reproducing. So I was feeling pretty cocky. So we sent in our samples, and the results came back a couple weeks later. And in our samples, there were 87 different chemicals, 4 of which weren't even registered in the United States. So as your bees are out foraging in that 2.5 mile radius, they can be exposed to, obviously, a tremendous amount of toxins that we apply or your neighbors apply to their lawn or their garden or the mosquito spray or what have you, that bees, as they're foraging not only for pollen and nectar, but propolis and water, will bring these back to the colony. And many times these are, of course, stored in the wax, and wax cells are where baby bees are raised and honey is stored. So there's implications there. These are, this is a pie chart of residue samples found in the beehive. And if you look at, 7% are herbicides, from people spraying, an herbicide, Roundup or something out there. There's fungicides out there that the bees have come in contact with in the environment. Certainly insecticides as people spray things for, roaches and other bugs. Everybody says, the world's coming to an end because of neonics, but we only found about 3% of those in residues in the beehive. But look at that 42%. 42% of all chemicals found in the beehive are the ones we put in. Is that terrible? Yes. Do we have to do it? Yes. This is why we need to be following label directions, being super selective, not treating at will, or prophylactically treating. You have to sample, find out your Varroa, and do you need to treat? And does your Varroa count mean that you treat with this product or something less toxic or something essential oil that's labeled? All these things have to be taken in mind in order to be a good beekeeper manager. Chemicals are found in beeswax. What do bees make and what do they build? They build their home out of beeswax. And that's why foundation, or you allowing bees to build comb, should be as pure as possible. The bees, of course, when they're raising brood, a larval skin will be left behind, and bees will apply propolis in there and cover it up, and it kind of contains most of that. In honey supers, many times it's not. Honey is slightly acidic. And so if there's chemicals in the beeswax, sometimes that acid will draw it out. Beebread. Bees don't eat pollen. They have a heck of a time eating pollen. It's hard to digest. The pollen grain, pollen holds sperm, plant sperm, the male element. And if that male element is going to be transported through the air, exposed to sunlight, UV, temperature, humidity, it has to be protected inside that pollen grain. And it's inside this hard shell called an exene, and it has a little micropore where it can get out if it gets in the right spot. But bees don't have chewing, crunching mouth parts. They can't crunch it up. They can't chew it up. So in the process of fermenting this pollen, making bee bread, A lot of this internal material is expelled so that it becomes available to the bees. And then sometimes because of osmotic pressure difference in a bee's gut, that pollen will also disengorge itself of what's inside. But most of the nutrition that bees have to feed their baby sisters, because foragers don't eat much of anything other than honey, nectar for energy, is in bee bread. And how do you know the bee bread is clean, has the less amount of chemicals in it, either from what's in the environment or what we put in a beehive? Because remember, 2/3 of mites are behind cappings, hidden and safe. And if they're hidden and safe, how do you get to them? This is why you have to read and follow label directions. This is a guy, Tibor Szabo, from Canada. Well-known, well-respected bee researchers back in the 60s. He was aware of Varroa mites and what they did. And Tibor said at one time, when people were talking about, well, why don't we just breed honeybees that are resistant to Varroa mites? And there have been some breeding programs that have shown some effect, but not much. And Tibor said, breeding honeybees to fend themselves, protect themselves from Varroa would be like trying to breed sheep resistant to wolves. So we have to use IPM strategy, integrated pest management, using multiple systems to control Varroa mite, because not one thing works. And we love one thing working, that you don't have to think about it. You don't have to do multiple things, but you can't do that with Varroa mites in 2020. And remember that the Varroa life cycle is tied to the honeybee, which is tied to the seasons. The bees and you and I are always preparing for winter. And with that in mind, Varroa control should be a part of this never-ending saga. Oh, here we go. Remember this one? Always follow label directions. Memorize that, please. Because controlling Varroa mites is different for these guys. This is commercial beekeepers in a staging area in California getting ready to go to almond pollination. I'm a backyard beekeeper. I have half a dozen colonies in my home in Ohio. And I can get out there and I can take them apart and I can look and I can... Commercial beekeeping isn't beekeeping in my mind. It's production agriculture. You can't do that with 10,000 colonies. So commercial beekeepers' management tactics have to be different than us with one of these in our backyard where we can actually be beekeeper managers. We can actually take the time to select management practices to control not only Varroa mites, but small hive beetles and AFB and EFB and nosema and all these things that can impact honeybee health. Because honeybees have a ton of challenges. Primary stress, can you imagine what other insect's nest can you pick up and put on a truck and drive it to California and then drive it back? You can't. That's why honeybees are important. You can pick up their nest, move it, they'll readjust, but it's tough on them. It's stressful on them. They have nutrition issues, they have temperature issues, they have all these things, but they're tough. And then we have factor in Varroa mites. on top of that stress, and viruses and fat body destruction. And then you have the secondary pathogens. You have those AFBs and EFBs that are taking advantage of a stressed and a honeybee that's immune system is compromised, and the viruses and the nosema and the fungi. I'm surprised there's any honeybees alive at all. Honeybees are tough until they're not. So, sampling for Varroa mites, a variety of ways to sample. The best way to sample, and the only way to get a truly accurate count, is to do an alcohol wash with 100 bees or 300 bees, and then you do the math to find out how many Varroa mites are per 100 bees. Because that, certainly you're sacrificing 100 bees, but if a queen's laying 2,000 bees a day, they're losing more than 100 just from aging and out in the open, getting hit by a truck, driving down the road, and birds eating them, and everything else. You have to find out. So if you have, and somebody here can do the math, you all can do the math actually. If you have, let's say in a perfect world, in your alcohol wash, 3 mites per 100 bees, which is good. But you have 30,000 bees in that colony. And you have 3 per 100. Can you see how many Varroa mites are in your colony and their potential to reproduce on your newly laid eggs that are going to produce larvae and pupa for replacement bees? That's a lot of Varroa mites that you have to think about. It's not 3 mites in your colony. It's 3 mites per 100 in 30,000. And the best thing that you can use after you've forgotten everything that I've said over the last, my gosh, I don't usually talk this long, an hour, is a Honeybee Health Coalition Tools for Varroa Management Guide, which you can get on their site and download. You can print it out, whatever you want. And there's also 12 videos that show how to sample, how to treat, what to treat with. And all these things are really great because they're kind of designed for your next bee meeting, for your local club. And you can share all these things. But I've talked to many, many researchers who say, when you ask them, what's the best resource for educational outreach to teach beekeepers about how to control Varroa, it's Tools for a Varroa Management Guide. It teaches you how to do all this stuff, and then it goes through the products, gives you the pluses and minuses, and then you can decide what's best to treat with for your particular situation. So Tools for a Varroa Management Guide, Honeybee Health Coalition. And how do you know how many Varroa mites you have? Well, we just kind of went through that. You have to monitor, 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 and then monitor and make your own decision. If some of you have looked at the Bee Informed Partnership survey that they do yearly and look at the questions they ask beekeepers, and beekeepers will say, well, I never sampled for Varroa and my bees all died, so it must be the farmer down the road. That is just having blinders on because they were too lazy to sample and monitor, 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 and then make their own decision. So, being new to Ohio, I want to thank you from the shores of Lake Erie. My office on Lake Erie is just a little past that palm tree, for those who you have not been to Lake Erie, but I would encourage you to come. And I thank you all for your patience over this last hour. Thank you. And I think we might have questions up there, maybe. Let's see what we got. And I have one from Michael.
Okay.
It says, I treated a hive of mine and left 2 supers on. I don't plan on selling this honey, but I'm wondering if it's safe for me to eat. What would you recommend? I would recommend you don't eat it and that you perhaps save that honey. It might have low levels of whatever you treated with, but it probably isn't acute or that chronic to honeybees. So I would actually feed it back to the honeybees and I wouldn't eat it myself. From Lynn, does oxalic acid vaporization have a high mortality rate? I seem to lose or impair 1 queen a year after once-a-week treatments for 3 weeks. She is either killed outright or suffers a major decline in production. The mites are knocked down, so that is a plus. Lynn, you just hit a sore spot on Jerry Hayes because oxalic acid vapor is very damaging to honeybees, tremendously damaging to honeybees. Let's use this, if you can visualize this. Let's say you have a parasite on you the size of a basketball and you can't get it off. And I can't help you get it off. But what we decide to do is use a caustic acid vapor on it. And so how do you concentrate that? So what we do is we lock you in your closet and vaporize this caustic acid in the closet so that it impacts the smaller Varroa mite. Now, for you, it's going to burn your eyes, might burn your hair and your skin, certainly is going to burn your trachea, your breathing tubes, all these things, and damage honeybees specifically because first you're using it at the wrong time of the year. If you're going to use it, and there's data from Europe, Northern Europe, that if you use it in perhaps January or February when there is no brood and all the mites are exposed or phoretic dispersal, one treatment with oxalic acid actually does pretty well. But remember, 2/3 of your mites are behind capped cells. And if you're treating once a week for weeks, the worker bees certainly have a limited lifespan, but who's getting hit every time, Lynn? The queen is getting hit every time. And one of the issues is on queens and workers is that the bee's nose is at the tip of their antenna. And so if with a caustic acid, with multiple treatments of a caustic acid, if you damage their nose, how do honeybees communicate? One of the primary ways is through odors, pheromones, pheromones, that tell the bee colony what's going on, what to do. So if you damage their nose, damage the queen's nose, she can't tell what's going on. The bees can't tell what's going on. And so those bees may think that she's damaged, not good, and will kill her, replace her, or she'll die because she can't get attention from the bees to take care of her. So don't use oxalic acid more than once in late winter. And if you do, remember that you are damaging the bees and damaging the queen every time you use it. We have, oh, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate that. Deborah Corcoran, how many varroa mites emerge from a cell that will feed on another bee? The number is about, and this of course is wrong, but this is science, about 2.5 females will mated females will emerge from the cell. So say two females emerge from a cell and then enter another cell and are reproducing, and they produce two that go out. So, you know, if you have 1,000 mites in your colony and they produce two females, that's 2,000 in 21 days. Another 21 days, there's going to be 4,000 and 8,000 and 16,000. And you can see how quickly the varroa mite population can build up because of the varroa mites that are left in your colony even after treatment. The death, and from Corrine, what is the death rate of bees using oxalic acid dribble? Oxalic acid dribble can be used. It's difficult to use in the wintertime because you have to have warm or hot sugar syrup on it and keep it dissolved. If it starts to separate, you can kill a whole colony of bees with that. And how oxalic acid works, and I think this is kind of interesting and pretty cool actually, is varroa mites, of course, are covered in a cuticle. They're a hard covering, you know, like, cardboard over them. Nothing can get through except on the bottoms of their feet. They don't have cuticles on the bottom of their feet. They have foot pads that are used to hang on to bees and other structures and what have you. And what happens is the oxalic acid is absorbed through those foot pads into the body of the varroa mite, and that's where that oxalic acid crystallizes, and then those crystals cut, damage the inside of the varroa mite and cause it to, you know, bleed to death or die or what have you. So that's how that works. And death rate on honeybees is basically how it's applied and if it's applied correctly. And I don't know anybody that can do that correctly. Gunnar, is it possible that a strong colony manages to get rid of varroa mites on its own? In other words, can you get lucky and not have any issues for years? Possibly, Gunnar, if you feed your bees and let them swarm all the time, because then their colony can't build up to become a varroa nursery and produce lots and lots of varroa. This is one of the ways that commercial beekeepers, IPM techniques to control varroa mites, is they try to make, go south into Florida, Georgia, and make lots of splits to build up their colony numbers, knowing they're going to lose so many. But those splits break up that reproductive cycle of varroa mites, and they can persist a little bit longer if you're not producing a honey crop, using that before you have to actually use a varroa treatment. Mark, I did not see FormicPro mentioned in your slides. Do you think it's a safer treatment? I don't like anything that's an organic acid because it's an acid, Mark. And formic acid has the ability to penetrate those cappings of developing brood. The cappings on honey are beeswax. They're solid. They're there to protect, to put that honey in a sealed environment. The cappings on brood are made out of larval skins and other things that are porous, because that larva, that pupa, has to breathe, and so you have to have that air exchange, and formic acid can penetrate that and kill that larva and the pupa, which of course is a varroa control unto itself, but it all depends on how much it kills it, because all these organic acids are, temperature and humidity sensitive. Jeff, thank you, Jeff. I know there's been some research about whether varroa viruses stick around within wax. Any idea what the research suggests? The research suggests that, of course, viruses are everywhere. You know, you're at home, I'm assuming, you know, listening to this, and you have viruses all over your hand that you just put on your face, and it's on the handle of the faucet in your bathroom, and you know it's on the handle of the shopping cart at the big box, and that's why viruses are everywhere. And viruses are everywhere in a beehive. And viruses are in and can be incorporated in wax. But because wax is kind of encapsulating, most of the time that doesn't have an impact on brood that's developing in there. Bees, there again, you know, the former bee that was raised in there left the larval skin. The workers go in there and coat that cell, then that larval skin, with propolis, which has antibacterial properties. And so it's fairly virus free in relation to the rest of the colony, but is it pristine? No, it's not. There's viruses anywhere. And so this is where doing what you can to enhance, build, support the immune system of your honeybees is very important. From Harold, your thoughts on heat treatments for mites? That has been around for a very long time. When the old Soviet Union, the Russians first got Varroa mites before we did, their control procedure was to shake all the bees out of a colony. They put them in kind of a drum that was heated, and then they'd spin the drum, and the heat would knock off the Varroa mites, and then they put the bees back in the colony and what have you. Heat treatment in full colonies, like you see these devices that you heat up the comb or you heat up the colony or what have you, is pretty precarious, because the heat that they're talking about is right on the border or a little bit over of what kills the larva, what causes the larval food in the cell to heat and evaporate and become hard so the larva can't eat it. The wax gets soft. And so my thoughts on heat treatment for mites is not very good either, Harold, so I apologize. Shannon, we find Thymol very effective in control. What are your thoughts on effectiveness and different delivery methods? We use several OX, Formic, and Thymol based on season temp, but feel Thymol is a great tool in the bag. Yes, and I think the best Thymol product out there that has data with it shows that Apogard, it's that Thymol gel. You can buy it in a tub, or you can buy it in these metal kind of trays that you peel back and what have you. The numbers that they show about 90%, 90-some% control of Varroa using the Thymol gel. Actually, it's probably lower 80s, mid 80s, but because it is temperature dependent, you know, you don't want to get it too hot, but if you can apply it when it's, you know, 50 to 70 degrees, you get pretty decent control without a lot of collateral damage to your bees. From Lynn, thanks for your enlightening answer. Why on earth is this recommended treatment time to change methods? Yeah, you know, and this is the problem with, you know, I hate to say this, but, you know, your group, New York Wellness, I think is one of the few organizations that actually goes out to solicit those who can provide appropriate educational outreach to you. The worst thing that has happened to beekeeping is the internet, the web, where you've got that second-year beekeeper who is now the world's expert, has their own website and blog, and is telling you that to use green jello to control Varroa mites and all this other junk. So I would suggest that Honeybee Health Coalition, Tools for Varroa Management Guide. I would suggest, of course, university resources, PAM, Project Apis mellifera. There again, the Honeybee Health Coalition for other things as well. But be super selective about who you're asking for information, who you're inquiring for information, because there's a lot of baloney out there. And to be successful, you need to eat a little bit of baloney as possible. Last question, it looks like from Celeste. Please explain how mite treatments, like Mite Away strips, work to kill varroa mites and how the treatments can maintain the organic status of honey in the supers. You can't have organic honey in the United States. It's impossible. Bees forage in a 2.5 mile radius. Who lives in a location that in 2.5 mile radius of your beehives, there is nothing but grass and woods that isn't impacted directly by production agriculture, mosquito spraying, the jet stream bringing over chemicals from China, diesel fumes, cars, everything else. So there's no such thing as organic honey, so go ahead and just follow label directions and do your best.
So from Andrew, some pesticide labels say to treat all colonies in your yard at the same time. If one looks at testing as a way of determining that treatment is not needed, IPM principles are turned on their head if a miticide is applied when testing of a specific hive is not needed. Thoughts?
Yeah, and that's a great question. If you just have a few colonies in your yard, it's probably a good idea to probably treat them all, even though one might be better than the others. The issue here is what we call a Varroa bomb. This is where a colony, our biggest, healthiest looking colonies have the most Varroa in them because they have the most bees, because the queen is laying so well, the workers are doing so well, and that allows Varroa to have, reproductive elements of the larva there. And so eventually that colony is going to get sick, and that colony, as it weakens, other colonies, honeybees are like this. They're efficient. You could say they're lazy, but they're efficient. And so they will go to that colony and try to rob it out, take the resources that colony's already brought in so that they don't have to. And as a result, they'll be exposed to Varroa in that colony because that Varroa isn't stupid. They know that colony is failing and they want to get out of there and they want to reproduce and keep their genetics going too. And so this is where commercial beekeepers also treat whole yards at the same time, because it's hard keeping track of these colonies that may be Varroa bombs. And so this all kind of gets back to the product you're going to use to treat your colonies with as well. I would start out with something that may not be the best, may control 80% of the mites and see how it does. And then of course, and this is an assumption that I made. You sample, you find you got 8 mites per 100 bees, you treat, and then you have to sample again. Did our stuff work? If it worked, what did it knock them down to? Did it knock them down to 2 per 100 bees, or did it knock it down to 4 per 100 bees? Because if your colony has 3 or more Varroa mites per 100 bees, that colony is dead. It just doesn't know it right now. And so this is where your management skills really come into play.
Okay, a question from Aaron. Will there ever be an RNAi control?
And I worked for 9 years for Monsanto trying to figure that out and failed. Everybody hates Monsanto, but Monsanto had the money, They had the wherewithal. And this wasn't a GMO product or anything else. This was using normal natural process of RNAi in honeybees to theoretically control Varroa. There has been some data come out recently showing that there are genetically modified bacteria that produce the right kind of RNAi that will impact Varroa. So if you feed and treat the honeybees with this GMO bacteria and the bacteria get in the gut of the honeybees, it will produce this RNAi that has some control level to it. When I was at Monsanto, we had the same information. We had the same knowledge. We could have done that, but I told them that we're not doing anything GMO to a honeybee or a honeybee colony. And so can it be done? Is that the way to do it? I'm still a little bit shaky on that.
Okay, another question from Andrew. How many times can a foundress mite enter a cell?
You know, and that's another great question. She can do that 2 or 3 times actually before she runs out of eggs and sperm. And it kind of interesting as well. You know, we've kind of, this is Darwin in action. We've selected for mites. Used to be when a varroa mite, when the female exited a cell, she would jump on an adult honeybee and ride around in that brood area and, you know, pick out another cell. And it was just kind of good. And sometimes, you know, she might get groomed off or something, but for the most part, it was successful. And so now we've started treating for varroa mites, and there's varroicide residues in the colony and what have you. And so and also there's some hygienic bees. So what the varroa mite has learned, if you will, or the ones that didn't learn were killed, is so now the varroa mite, when she exits a cell, she stays many times on the comb. And if there's an open cell next to the cell she just emerged from, she'll enter that. She's trying to expose herself as little as possible anymore before she enters a cell that has a larva in it that she can use to reproduce. So this is why varroa control has gotten a little bit more precarious as well.
Okay, question from Linda. Based on your report of the distance the mites can travel, do you think screen bottom boards that would drop the mites onto a stand would be that helpful? Wouldn't they just climb back up?
You know, it's possible they could climb back up. I keep mine on stands, but they're on the bare ground underneath. And this is just a jury guess. My guess is that varroa mite hits the ground and its opportunity to find its way through the ground, through the grass, up the stand leg and back in the hive is probably slim and none, considering the jungle it has to go through and the predators it has to get by.
Okay, last question. What is your favorite mite treatment?
My favorite mite treatment is, first I use Apogard. Sample, if I have to treat, I use Apogard, Thymol gel, and then I sample again. And most of the time, 90% of the time, it knocks the mites down to that 1 or 2 level per 100 I'm looking for. If it doesn't, then I follow up with Apivar, which is amitraz, which is more toxic, but it doesn't have the residue issues that check mite does or fluvalinate does. It breaks down fairly quickly, but yet it kills those varroa mites that somehow survived or resistant to the Thymol gel.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jerry, for doing this. People really appreciate this, and good luck on bee culture, and people will be receiving an email.
And thank you, Pat, for inviting me. Thank you for New York Wellness. And if I can help you in any way, that's what I'm here for. And that's why we're beekeepers, is because we're all in this together. So I thank you very much, and all the best to you, and stay safe and well. Good night.